Great. Hello, everyone. On behalf of the Swiss Carbon Removal Platform for this CDR Swiss webinar on the policy white paper launch, we're very happy to have you all in this call. And we particularly welcome our three main speakers, Nicoletta Brazzola from ETH, Samuel Eberenz from the platform and the Stiftung Risiko-Dialog, as well as Matthias Honecker from Perspectives Climate Research. To give you a quick overview about the agenda, we will start with a short part on the intro and motivation of this white paper. We will then talk about the policy needs, which refer to the short and medium term activities. We will talk about policy mixes, particularly referring to three cases. We will then talk about policy visions, which refer to the long-term measures. We will conclude and end with a discussion and Q&A. So first, very brief definition for those who've never heard of carbon dioxide removal. There is a definition by Höglund. Carbon dioxide removal includes all solutions that remove CO2 from the short carbon cycle and store it permanently outside the atmosphere. And with this very short intro, I'll want to hand it over to Matthias, please.
Thanks, Nicholas, for the introduction. And let me start by also saying a very warm welcome and a very good afternoon to everyone. It is indeed good to see so many of you here. And then by also emphasizing that what we talk about today is really a group effort, or the result thereof, rather. We have, of course, the three of us, Nicoletta, Samuel, and I. We have been acting as a sort of a core team in the drafting process, but we had input from a number of co-authors that you can see here on the slide, and many ideas from people outside of that group in addition of it. And we had some discussions in workshop formats in the working group, in various formats, in person and online. And it was really a fruitful process of learning from one another on what aspects are relevant, how to think through challenges in different sectors, different policy aspects in the near and in the long term, ranging really from abstract, conceptual, theoretical reflections all the way to the very practical. And so I hope that what we'll present today and the white paper itself will reflect that richness to a certain degree. If you go to the next slide. As you can see, we received feedback on earlier versions with essentially members of the platform. I'm not going to read out every name, but you can see that this was a very rich and diverse group. And more broadly, also, again, input from the policy working group as such. But also to emphasize this clearly, none of these individuals' views is necessarily represented in the white paper, but rather the white paper stands as is and represents the views of the authors that are listed on the previous slide. So why did we embark on this? Well, besides being nudged by our friends at the Swiss Carbon Removal Platform, we wanted really to use an opportunity to take a step back, and as many processes unfold in Switzerland and abroad in the space of CDR-oriented policy, to think about the big picture in some sense, and then from there to again see how that big picture reflects onto the particular challenges that we see in setting policy. And for that specifically, we wanted to look at what is the particular challenges of removals and thus removals policy in Switzerland. What are the needs for example, financial support or regulatory clarity for different types of removals? And also to ask ourselves really at a very fundamental degree, are we thinking about this correctly? Because of course we all come through a certain path dependency in our thinking to such a new topic. And we wanted to make sure that the paradigms that we underlaid in our thinking about policy for CDR are appropriate, not just for the present day and age, but also for the long term when we have to move to net zero and potentially beyond. And so that's the key word for the next bullet point, is that we really also wanted to dream big. We suggested getting to net negative emissions before that was already built into policy. And we'll speak more on that later. And also to color that image of going net negative with a vision of how the world looks like when we get there, or more specifically, how the Swiss economy and policy landscape could be looking like when we get to a net negative economy. And so obviously there's an evolving policy landscape, and obviously there is the very important adoption of the Swiss Climate and Innovation Law that is also now today front and center as the next step of operationalizing different visions for CDR policy. And so we want to note that, and we'll speak a little bit on that later on. So, well, actually right now, so there's a very important key framing decision, and that's in Article 3, which really now sets for the first time a net negative target, quote unquote, after 2050. It also sets a very important frame in the sense that it outlines a downward slope for net emissions, both overall and also in specific sectors, or it sets the framework for that. And it also mandates the federal government and cantons to ensure that there is sufficient storage by 2050. Now, of course, what does it mean to have sufficient storage can be interpreted in different manners. Also, the question to which extent such storage should be available within the Swiss boundaries or abroad. But at least this is a foundational mandate which wasn't there beforehand in such clarity. Furthermore, it gives the opportunity, the mandate for the Federal Council to set guiding values for CDR in Article 4, which again can be a very important tool to give guidance to markets, to private sector actors of what's to be expected over time, and thus certainty for planning. There's also the sort of umbrella provision that the financial support can be given also to the private sector through the existing instruments, noting that there's not going to be duplication of funding and regulatory steering. So how that will look like, we have yet to see, but it's also, again, a very important sort of framing decision. And furthermore, as we look to a need for public infrastructure investments for carbon management overall, this Article 7 that provides risk capital, or at least the opportunity to provide such capital, is important to again, get a sense of certainty in the markets as is needed for some of those investments having a very long time horizon. And with that, I'll hand over to Nicoletta.
Thank you so much, Matthias. So I will now jump to sort of the core part of the white policy paper, where we really looked at the policy needs for Switzerland, and then also looked at different policy pathways to achieve the CDR that we will need. And our background was the release of the CDR roadmap this last May in 2022 by the Federal Office of the Environment. And in this roadmap, they lay out some milestones for Switzerland to first, in a pioneering phase, start experimenting and deploying in CDR, and then in a scaling phase, really getting the diffusion of CDR up, so to get to 2050 to a point where Switzerland would be able to counterbalance any residual emissions with negative emissions. And this is depicted here in this picture. So next slide, please. So starting from these identified sort of milestones, we then went into looking what are exactly the policy needs that are needed first in the pioneering phase to set the scene and pave the way for the future deployment, and then in the scaling phase to really get CDR to diffuse. And I will now go more into the detail of what are the policy needs in each of these phases. So next slide. So here, for the short-term policy needs in the pioneering phase, we identified different needs that are depicted in the left-hand side. And then for each of these needs, we really went into the detail of looking at what are key actions to tackle them. Obviously, today I will not iterate through all of these actions, but I just selected a few of them. So first, we identified that facilitating interconnected stakeholders is very important. This is, for example, through CCS hubs and clusters, but also by integrating different sectors in cross-sectoral CDR methods, or also in creating networks that can then engage with the EU, for example, having to have a voice in the pipeline plans. Then we identified that it's important to establish from the very beginning very clear legal frameworks that translate the CDR targets into law and separate and are kept separated from emission reduction targets. Moreover, we will also need to revise the legal existing frameworks, such as, for example, the waste regulation, in order to tackle future CO2 storage. Then in this phase, it's absolutely necessary to keep on promoting innovation and development of CDR methods. And that's for sure important for novel CDR methods, but also for established ones, especially focusing on performance improvement, but also on missing links, such as, for example, soil carbon sequestration or domestic CO2 storage. Then a very important task is definitely that of de-risking the first CDR movers and also investments in the CO2 infrastructure. And to do so, the government should use some public tools to share the risks of these initial investments and also set the legal basis for a contract-based provision of CDR through public procurement. Finally, it's important that Switzerland continues engaging in bilateral and multilateral agreements that will set the way for future CO2 transport and storage abroad. So then coming to the midterm policy needs, here we identified that it's important to revise legal frameworks to really eliminate any barriers that are on the way to the diffusion of CDR. And to that end, for example, it's important to facilitate permitting processes of CDR projects and also include some participatory and social characterization elements that can enhance the acceptance for CO2 storage. Then it's important to find ways to mobilize large-scale finance flows in order to really reach these rates of CDR necessary. And thereby, there are two key actions that are important. First, that of de-risking the investment environment, which can be done also by providing a robust business case for CDR, and then really creating mechanisms that ensure streams of revenues that are not only reliant on government support. Finally, we will also need to develop standards and mechanisms for the international CDR cooperation. And these should minimize risks for the host countries of CDR projects and also clarify liabilities and ensure that double counting does not happen. So in a second part of the policy of the white paper, we then went more into an imaginative sort of path, and we explored different possible approaches to tackle this task of mobilizing large-scale finance flows and incentivizing demand for CDR. And here we decided to tackle the issue by three different approaches because we recognize this is a quite complex task and there's no real consensus on whether a single approach is the best one. So we started off by looking at different paradigms or archetypical policy approaches in climate policy, and there are three policy pathways from them. And these are the only carrots and no sticks, the polluter pays, and the command and control pathways. So while in the white paper, these pathways take up quite a lot of space and there's a lot of details on them, I will here just give an overview of their high-level characteristics. So the only carrot and no sticks pathway is a pathway that uses, for example, more subsidies or incentives in order to financially support CDR and incentivize the demand for it. Its advantages is that it does a very good job at addressing near-term barriers, and also it's ideal for promoting innovation and fair competition, also for less mature CDR methods. Moreover, subsidies and incentives usually are very publicly accepted and thus more politically feasible. The risks are, however, that per se alone, this pathway does not solve the issue of long-term CDR revenue, and also is possibly not sufficient alone to really scale up demand to the level necessary. Moreover, it relies strongly on national budget, which means it only works as long as CDR rates are kept small. But we are seeing examples of this kind of policies that are arising elsewhere, for example, in Luxembourg, where there is currently being discussed a negative emission tariff, which would work a bit like a feed-in tariff by having the government ensure a fixed price to CDR developers. Then in the second policy pathway, the polluter pays, the overall mechanism is to price emissions via CO2 levies or emission trading schemes, and including CDR by crediting the removals. And this pathway fits really well into the current governance model, and also is great at signaling long-term CDR policy. Moreover, since it's a market-based mechanism, it fosters competition and cost reduction. However, the risks are that the price volatility on these mechanisms, the emission price volatility, can make the revenue for CDR quite uncertain and thus keep the investment risks quite high. Moreover, it can possibly deter mitigation by expanding the amount of allowances, for example, on an emission trading scheme. The final pathway is the command and control pathway, which uses legally binding sector-specific emission targets that are basically impossible to achieve without some CDR deployment. Or alternative, it can even really be seen as mandates of CDR deployment, for example, in the form of take-back obligations for any residual emissions. And this pathway is great because it's relatively simple, like it has a relatively simple governance structure, and also it exerts a direct control over the carbon budget. And moreover, it gives some certainty on the amount of CDR that will be needed in the future, and thus make the investment environment less risky. However, it's quite an untested policy approach, which is thought to have quite a low political and public acceptance. And this is also because it possibly places a lot of the economic burden of CDR on hard-to-abate sectors, for example, agriculture. And lately, we've seen something a bit in this direction arising, for example, in the EU Net Zero Industry Act, where there is an obligation for EU-based gas and oil extractors to provide the future CO2 storage infrastructure. Okay, then obviously these are three different approaches. They do not exist in abstraction or completely distinct from each other, but in reality, we will see a mixing of different policy approaches to leverage the strengths of each of these approach. But Sam will now go more into the depth of it and show you some cases for different CDR policy, CDR methods.
Thank you, Nicoletta. So we decided to illustrate what policy needs and consequently policy mixes could be applied for different CDR methods. And one of the things really came along a lot in discussions that there's a lot of different CDR methods, but not one single bullet. There's no one single CDR method that is ready at the moment already, or we know that it will be ready to deliver globally gigatons of CDR that are needed according to the climate simulations at payable costs and without economic, social, or environmental impacts that can't be handled. That's why we really need this big portfolio of different CDR methods that have their strength on different timescales. It's also interesting when we talk about regulation that they affect different sectors, from the agriculture to the energy sector, for example, or the waste sector, and they have different prices at the moment, and will probably also have different costs in the future. For that reason, differentiated policy needs are needed to somehow leverage the development and future availability. However, this brings us into a conflict with policy making between optimizing the output, so the realization of long-term CDR capacities, versus a fair competitive conditions between methods that have different conditions and prices today and in the near future. Here is an overview of different CDR methods that are discussed in Switzerland or have direct or indirect relevance for Switzerland. I will not go into detail there. As you can see, there's a lot of different approaches affecting the biosphere, industry, and the geosphere. However, Nicola, if you can press next, we focused on three. I've already been asked when publishing the white paper why we focused on these three CDR methods. So the reason is manifold. One of the reasons is that with the authors team, we looked what expertise do we have in the working group and in the authors team, and who wants to write about which CDR method. And we also decided to take examples that have very differentiated but exemplary challenges. And these are biochar in the sector of biochar and soil management, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, known as BECCS, or also called biogas for biomass carbon removal and storage, and direct air capture and storage, DACS. And here we compare the premises that we identified for the current and expected future conditions for the upscaling of these three CDR methods. So let's start with biochar. Biochar is the product of pyrolysis. Biomass is treated in a way that energy is produced, but at the same time, biggest part of the carbon in the biomass is trapped in the remaining charcoal, which is then often called biochar in the English word. It's called Pflanzenkohle or Biokohle in German. This is already actually a practice that is well established and in varied form has been going on for centuries. And the modern ways of doing this in industrial ways, it's been around for decades already. So it's a mature technology, which has a large theoretical potential of several megatons per year, so several million of tons per year in Switzerland. However, this comes with potential biomass use target conflicts, because these high potentials can only be realized if really most of the biomass, like wood, for example, in Switzerland, is directed directly or indirectly in cascading use into biomass production. However, because this is ready already and can be implemented in a decentralized manner, this is really the CDR method that's already quite visible and has the largest share on the voluntary carbon markets. However, with the downside that usually the prices that are achieved on the market do not cover the costs. That means that co-benefits need to have some monetary value to really make this viable in an economic way. Also, what is reflected in regulation is that there's co-benefits, but are also long-term side effects and potential negative effects of using biochar, both on the biomass sector and also on soils where it is put, for example, for storage, that lead to regulations that don't clearly incentivize the use of biochar for CDR. Next up is BECCS. This is a pathway where carbon capture and storage, so the capturing of CO2 from a point source, where a lot of CO2 is in the flue gas, for example, from burning something, is captured where the burning material or the fuel behind is biomass again. So this is why it's called bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. This is a pathway that has been demonstrated. And for example, with the DEMAP-Kammer research project in Switzerland. And it is quite infrastructure intensive because we need capturing devices at the industrial sites, for example, waste to energy plants, biogas plants, cement plants, etc. We need transport facilities, CO2 management infrastructure, and storage at large scales. Another downside is that there's an energy penalty. For example, if waste to energy that produces electricity and district heating needs to give away or invest part of the energy produced there to do the capture. And it also comes with high both investment costs and operating costs. At the moment in Switzerland, we are faced with a chicken or egg problem, that there's large investments needed. However, the question is who starts? Do you first invest into a capture plant at capture facility, at the plant, before you know where the transport is going? Do you first invest in a transport hub or a pipeline, or secure storage before you start with the first two? This is also hindered by a lack of a viable revenue model to finance the large operating costs. At the other side, it comes with synergies with carbon capture and storage, which is often happening in the same, is the technology behind it also offers happens in the same sector. For example, in waste to energy, part of the waste is plastic, which is fossil based, which produces fossil emissions, and part is biomass that is burned in, which produces biogenic emissions. So it's often a mix of BECCS and CCS. The third case study is DAX, direct air capture and storage. This is the filtration of CO2 directly from the ambient air, which of course has a much lower concentration of CO2 than flue gas from a jamming. This has been demonstrated prominently in Switzerland by Climeworks over the last decades already, with the pilot plant on Iceland, where it's also combined with geological storage. However, it is still at a low commercial maturity level. For the Swiss climate pathway, there's also a difference to biochar and BECCS, that there's no role foreseen at the moment from official sides to really implement this in Switzerland due to the high energy demand and also still the lack of geological storage, because for DAX it really makes sense to put it somewhere where there's renewable energy available and at high amounts of renewable energy, and also storage facilities for really megatons or gigatons of CO2. That's why the role for Switzerland is more to implement it abroad, which is also allowed for in current policy. However, at the current moment, there's still a lack of business model, even though there's investment interests and some pioneers buying DAX credits already. And compared to the other approaches, it's really focused on the pure purpose of removing CO2 from the atmosphere. So it doesn't have real co-benefits as we see some for biochar, for example. At the other side, it can profit from the BECCS and CCS processes and progress, for example, in Europe, because it also needs geological storage. Next slide, please. So as these different conditions and premises of the three CDR methods already hint on, they really come with differentiated policy and regulatory needs. For biochar, one of the regulations at the moment is that if you want to use biochar and put it into soils and get compensation credits for that from the obligatory markets, there's strong regulations and restrictions what amount you can put where that are related to the fertilizer law. So it really interacts with the regulation of the agriculture sector, for example. And because the costs on the volatile markets, the price on the volatile markets don't cover the costs, it demands for a valorization of the co-benefits. For example, if cattle is fed with biochar, it can reduce methane emissions. There can be a reduction from other emissions from the soils. There can also be positive impacts on soil quality and also non-agricultural uses that could come with co-benefits. However, if they are not, there's no money received for that, it doesn't help with scaling up biochar. That's why it really needs an integration of biochar production and use in the Swiss agriculture and other sectors. For example, the construction sector is debated at the moment. And intensification of a sustainable sourcing of biomass, for example, a cascade of the use of wood. And this is really important more from a sustainability perspective to avoid subsidiary distortions that, for example, high quality wood should really be used for building, and maybe the cut-offs are used for biochar, or the wood is used for biochar after the end of the life cycle of the first use product it was made for. Then for BECCS, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, the big infrastructure and investment needs need coordinated infrastructure and planning and investment that was already mentioned. And to finance it, there's both demand side and supply side interventions thinkable. For example, an obligation scheme for hard to abate emissions and fees for waste producers, both in a municipal and an industrial context. On the supply side, the de-risking already mentioned by Nicoletta could be achieved by revenue guarantees to industries that apply CCS in a BECCS context, and different incentive systems, for example, SDE++ or comparable to SDE++ in the Netherlands, reverse auctioning in Sweden, the CCS funding system in Denmark, or the EU Innovation Fund that can be used to give subsidies and support to the supply side implementation and scale up. The third case, DAX, direct air capture and storage, as I said, is still at a lower maturity level. So it still needs a lot of research and development support to lower the cost and energy demand of direct air capture. And this is really relevant if we want to aim at a future where CDR is really used globally on a gigaton scale, because while DAX doesn't have a lot of co-benefits, it also doesn't have a lot of land use demand, so it doesn't have trade-offs and target conflicts, for example, with biodiversity and food production, which makes it a big potential. However, only if there's really an excess of renewable energies. This is why the securing of long-term abundance of renewable energy is also needed, while at the same time, really, it needs to get more efficient with the use of energy and also cheaper to make it work. On the long-term, policies could support this next to research and development by leveling out competitive disadvantages due to the high prices to realize this long-term potential. However, this needs to be looked at very carefully if you also want to stay in a way technological agnostic. This is the conflict I mentioned in the beginning of me speaking. Yes. With this, to the policy visions, here we want to look a bit beyond 2050, where we hope to reach net zero in Switzerland and also globally. What could happen after net zero? So what we see also in the KIG, where it's just basically a buzzword that could have consequences for the regulation on the long term, is the term net negative, which is always a bit confusing because a lot of people speak about a climate positive future, which is basically the same as net negative emissions, meaning that we reduce more, we remove more CO2 or CO2 equivalent from the atmosphere than what is emitted. In this diagram here, which is based on the IPCC and IIASA, is this typical graph showing how the emissions, the net emissions with the bold line, dashed line, should develop to reach net zero and net negative, and really balance global temperatures, and in the long term even contribute to lower temperatures if we really manage to remove more CO2 from the atmosphere than greenhouse gases are emitted. The first, always very striking point here is the steep slope of emission reductions. Here now between the 2010s and 2040s, 2050, that needs to be achieved. And it's really, we can't be stressed enough that if this is not achieved, then the removals may be in the order of magnitude of 10%, 5%. It doesn't really matter of today's emissions are really very expensive without helping much. So we really need these strong emission reductions and scale up carbon dioxide removal to hopefully reach net zero. So why think about net negative? The first point is really net zero is a point target, and that's not only in time. As we can see here, it's also a global point target. So it could will not face a future where all countries reach net zero at the same time. At the same time, and once it is reached globally and average, it's not a stable situation. It could be the next day we're already negative if removals are increasing and emissions continue to fall. However, it could also be that 1 year we reach net zero and the next year we have more emissions than removals again. On the global point, there are some countries that will probably struggle more with reaching net zero than Switzerland in the next few decades, maybe because they're very dependent on fossil fuel production, maybe because of they're less privileged in the global competition. And with regard to development. And this raises really a question of joint and fair international efforts. So privileged countries probably need to get to negative by removing more than they emit before other countries do it. And I would count Switzerland to these privileged countries. And this is also anchored by in the Paris Agreement, where this principle of equity and common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities between countries in the light of different national circumstances. The next reason why to think about negative now already is what I mentioned before, that excess removals will be needed to lower temperatures, because we don't know where we're aiming now at the moment. Maybe 1.5 degrees, which is questioned a lot, but would keep us below a lot of dangerous tipping points ecologically and socially. Maybe 2 degrees, maybe 3 degrees, we really don't know where we're heading to. But even at 1.5 degrees, the world will not be a comfortable place to live in for the majority of the world population. This means that once we get to a peak of temperatures at the net zero setting, we really need removals that can then be one of the few tools we have to really bring temperatures down, maybe to pre-industrial or close to pre-industrial levels on the longer scale. With this long-term perspective, of course, strong CDR industry will also be an economic stability factor for countries in the next decades, when also maybe our economical systems will be quite challenged by climate change and climate change adaptation and mitigation. The last point, could you go back? Yes, is really that CDR can be a tool to counteract accelerated climate system breakdown. This is something often forgotten when we look at the IPCC reports, where it is written, but it's not in the most known visuals, that there are tipping points like the polar caps that are melting, permafrost that is melting and releasing methane, but also the breakdown of the Amazon forest, for example, that could really release much more greenhouse gases from these collapsing ecosystems and glaciers, for example. And when we face this, it might be we really just need to rely as humanity for survival on CDR methods. This is, of course, sounds like a horror scenario, but it's not science fiction. It's really in the projections what is possible in climate research. So I will quickly mention 4 paradigms that could be needed to sustain CDR post net zero, because these mid-term policy mixes or policy pathways that Nicoletta presented are really focused on reaching net zero, but they become maybe less effective or too costly on the long term when we have reached net zero and still want to keep removing more and reach negative. I will not go into detail here now for time reasons. However, I want to mention them quickly. The first one is the toxic waste removal, which is really focused on, we have released an externality into the atmosphere and need to get it back to reduce its negative ecological and social and economic impacts, which is nicely illustrated by the waste to energy sector's efforts at the moment, where capturing the CO2 can be seen as one last step in really closing the leakage into the environment from our waste sector. The carbon depth, you can read more on in the paper, is really the idea that the responsibility for historical emissions is paid fairly in a fair and equitable way, and polluters need to issue carbon debt already now that come with interest rates, and this can incentivize the emission reduction in the present as well as secure funding for future removals, and turns a bit the discussion about mitigation deterrence. And this is already a paradigm shift that would need to get started in the near future, so it can effectively incentivize or pay for removals in the future. The non-CO2 pricing is basically all about the greenhouse gases that are not CO2, which also need to be considered to really reach a stable climate. And hybrid governance is all about the combining both public regulation and private governance, which is already happening, and they can be linked even tighter through certification. And this is just a teaser for the last big chapter of the white paper, where we invite you to change perspective a bit and really zoom into from a carbon removal utopian future in 2065, where Switzerland is net negative, has been net negative for 15 years already, since after reaching net zero in 2050. and we sketch out also a bit of a anecdotal timeline how we could have gotten there in the future. I will not take you through this now. These bullet points just are here to give you an impression, but this is really something for a close or even maybe a close read, maybe even a holiday read for you to get some inspiration to where to move in the next few decades. At the same time, we realized when putting year numbers in there, for example, what needs to happen in 2027 and 2030, realized how urgent this whole issue of policymaking is, that we're talking about 2050, but it's really not so far away. We need to start preparing now. And with this, I hand over to Matthias for the conclusions.
Thanks. Can go on the next slide. Yeah. So there's a number of parallel developments, as many of you are keenly aware, and the KIG is really only one element. Basically, the revised CO2 law will address the first period to implement the overarching vision on which I touched at the outset. Later on, there are ordinances yet to come for the second and the third periods, respectively. So for the decades from the 30s and the 40s. And those will need to really lay out in much more detail how policy will ensure that we have a scale up of CDR that matches with these overarching needs that we see. One particularly pertinent element in these developments is certainly the operationalization of the provisions that allow for funding in private sector activities in the very near term. So the ways in which the conditions are laid out for that type of support will be crucial in steering the types of CDR that we see develop, and whether that's actually happening effectively. The other aspect is certainly the international dimension, where there is already an ongoing effort to incentivize removals also abroad of relevance to Swiss policy. And that is in and of itself an opportunity also to pilot results-based CDR incentivization more broadly, not just for the purpose of purchasing certificates for international transfer. Then many of you are also, I think, aware that in the EU, there's quite a few things that are moving, most centrally the carbon removal certification mechanism, CRCF, or framework, which as it stands right now, certainly has a number of open questions that we see a bit skeptically, because they are pretty fundamental questions that remain, in particular around what type of demand will be generated through, hopefully through regulation, through obligations, but also on how removals in land use, in agriculture, and utilization of carbon in building materials may be included, and whether or not the monitoring and reporting and verification approaches will be stringent enough that we have the results that are actually on the label, and not to have something that's kind of misleading. And we're a little bit concerned by the inclusion of what amounts to essentially emissions reductions in the framework that is called a removal framework. So hopefully we'll see more clarification as this process progresses on the EU level. And then the other piece is the reform of the EU emissions trading system, which is important for Switzerland because Switzerland will mirror essentially the changes that the EU adopts. And those pertain in particular on how biogenic carbon is or is not considered under the emissions trading system. And that obviously impacts on whether removals from biomass use with carbon capture and storage would end up being incentivized or not through the emissions trading system. So important developments there. We will see those impact on Swiss policy as well. And then there's the UNFCCC process, where the supervisory body under the so-called Article 6.4, which is essentially the follower to the clean development mechanisms in many ways, for the centrally organized transfer of credits between parties, between countries under the Paris Agreement. And the requirements for removals there are also in many ways a linchpin for what we expect to become somewhat of a sort of guiding star on how carbon removals and results should be monitored, reported, and verified. So that's also an important parallel development. And finally, important clarifications also still need to be done at the level of the IPCC, which impacts on the UNFCCC, as this provides the guidance for how countries are to track and account for mitigation results, both emissions reductions and CDR, in their national inventories. And that's an important basis also, again, for the international transfer of credits. So important clarifications needed so that we can really move forward in good alignment between the different countries that are developing policy. But the developments are positive, I should say. Certainly, I was encouraged by the supervisory body developments for the Article 6.4 mechanism recently. Yeah. Next one, please. And at the same time, noting that encouragement, I should note that there's important political battles that are certainly going to emerge as we become more concrete. For example, when it comes to sectoral targets and their operationalization, certainly if we start to talk about specific targets for removals versus emissions reductions on a sector-by-sector level, that's going to be highly contentious. And then within sectors, certainly one will see to some degree actors battling for the quote-unquote right to be considered hard to abate. And so there's a whole suite of interesting but also challenging dynamics that we expect to play out over the coming years, both in Switzerland and in other countries. And that is certainly the backdrop concern on these battles is certainly the need to avoid that emissions reductions are being deterred through the prospect of being able to do CDR in the future. And so it's important that this is done under public scrutiny to a certain degree, as much as possible, so that the actors who are pushing for certain results are also held to account, and that we have clarity where this is going. Because the headline numbers of even decade oriented targets is one thing, but of course, how those are translated afterwards is then where really the devil lies in the detail. We also do need, and Samuel also alluded to this, we do need Switzerland to step up and again take the role of an international climate leader. Switzerland is diplomatically indeed a very strong force, including on climate. And we also need this to be reflected, in my view, and I think in our view, on basically progressive CDR policy that shows examples of how it can be done fairly, and really move rapidly towards net zero and beyond. And in all that, of course, one needs to navigate carefully the public perception. We've seen that very clearly with the last vote on the CO2 Act revision, and yet at the same time do so while ensuring that there is indeed support for meaningful action. So it's not easy, but I think having these opportunities for exchange as we do here are quite helpful for this. Next one. And again, by means of an outlook on the coming efforts, it's clear that there's some very overarching, very important foundations in the KIG. And one of those I'd like to highlight in particular is it's Article 9, which essentially in some ways mirrors a similar article in the Paris Agreement, which calls for aligning financial flows overall not just climate finance or carbon markets, but financial flows overall with the objectives of, in the Paris Agreement, the objectives of the Paris Agreement, and in this case, with the objectives of the KIG, which both are pretty much aligned. And this clearly offers a lot of opportunities for far-reaching measures if it is taken up and taken up seriously as a tool to nudge financial flows in the right direction, including for CDR. And like I said, the operationalization of the KIG is ongoing, and it will be done in 3 phases, essentially, from here on out to 2050. And each of those phases will offer an opportunity to fine-tune and adapt as needed as we see the effectiveness of measures play out, or where we might see them fall short. It will be important that we are able to adapt as we go along. Next slide, and I think back to Samuel.
Yes, thanks. I will have some closing comments. Thanks to Nicolette and Matthias for your insights. I really want to highlight as an ending point that really the KIG is a policy framework. As Matthias showed us, there's a lot to be still actually regulated and policies made based on the KIG. And I want to again highlight that Switzerland really is in the privileged position that we are a rich country and we don't depend on fossil fuel industry internally in Switzerland. And this really puts Switzerland at the spot of being a pioneer, because if Switzerland can't make it, it's really hard to expect it from the world to do it. And my guideline, what I had in discussions a lot of time, what does this now mean? How does Switzerland go to net zero? In a nutshell, I would say we need to really get to a point where we stop importing fossil fuels, so oil and gas. Then we have some hard to abate emissions, as said, for example, waste to energy sector, where we need to apply CCS that produce some negative emissions and avoids others. And then we need some more carbon removal for these extra residual emissions. That sounds quite easy. We all know how hard it is, but it's really, the pathway is clear, and the big question is how to make it possible. And one big point there is to really go along this path in a participatory manner, include different voices, and have a fair share and fair distribution of burdens, but also benefits that come with it, both inside Switzerland and internationally. Next slide, please. So what is next? Matthias already mentioned a lot about the CO2 ordinance regarding the point sources. We'll see more coordinated efforts and pioneer projects for the CO2 management, the capture, transport, and the storage in Switzerland, outside Switzerland. A lot of open questions, but the principles of the pathways are clear that it can work out, but it's not a small step to take. We see more international negotiations and also bids for storage capacities for really the big chunks of CO2, and increased public visibility and debate also on the fairness and distribution of costs and benefits, and so on. A lot of things that we haven't mentioned now that will probably also come up when the things get more concrete and the scaling up actually happens. So with this, we really want to invite all of you, of course, if you're not a member yet, to join the conversations between policymakers, administration, industry, research, civil society, and the public that we have within the Swiss Carbon Removal platform. So drop us a message. And at this point, I'd like to thank all of you for your attention. We'll have now 15 more minutes for some questions and discussion. But first, I will stop the recording and allow all of you to share your video and unmute yourselves.